joining us. Thanks for volunteering your time today. We appreciate you coming on and looking forward to this great conversation.
It's my pleasure, Shane. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yep. Everything sounds perfect.
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 Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Now I guess we could start off if you could give us a little bit about your background, how you decided to start looking into the environmental impacts of, different types of vehicles and so on.
No, that's a good question and a little bit of a complicated one. I'm a mechanical engineer. In my company, Convergent Science, we specialize in CFD, computational fluid dynamics. And we do a lot of different types of problems, a lot of different types of fluid problems. But historically, what we've really focused on and sort of where we grew up is in the internal combustion engine space. And so modeling, efficiency, emissions, helping design engines using CFD, that's really kind of what we did for many years. And then back, I would say in 2016, 2017, we started to see a lot of headlines in the media about how internal combustion engines are dead and countries started declaring bans. And it's like, well, okay, if we're going to get rid of internal combustion engines, then what do we have? What are we going to use? And so clearly, that was when Tesla was starting to come onto the scene in a much bigger way. And so electric vehicles were kind of declared the silver bullet technology. And so in thinking about that more, it didn't kind of seem right to me that that would be a one size fits all solution, especially given, the very different applications, the very different conditions around the world. And so I pulled a team together to sort of look at, what is the real environmental impact of an electric vehicle versus, say, a hybrid vehicle, a full hybrid where, the kind where the engine recharges the battery, you don't have to plug it in.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did a pretty detailed analysis of the United States. And that's a paper that was recently published in the Journal of Electrified Vehicles through SAE. And so that's kind of what led me down this road, and here we are today.
Well, that's awesome. And yeah, I can remember back to thinking whenever they were saying that internal combustion engines were going to be the end, kind of seeing the new hybrids pop up on to the scene and getting to drive them. It's very interesting topics. Now, kind of moving on with that, what is the significance of your research from a broader impact point of view?
Well, I would say, what I'm trying to do and what we're trying to do, and this is the message also in our book that was discussed earlier, my book with Felix Leach. Really, it's about how do we reduce greenhouse gases from transportation as fast as possible, right? So, the goal in my mind, the goal shouldn't be let's get electric vehicles on the road as fast as possible. The goal should be let's reduce greenhouse gases as fast as possible. Now, clearly, electric vehicles are a big part of that, right? And as we show in our paper and as we talk about in the book, in many regions in the world, they are the best solution from a greenhouse gas perspective today. But in many regions, they're not. And so I would say, the bigger impact of my work and our work is, trying to come up with ways and trying to come up with recommendations for how can we reduce greenhouse gases the fastest. And it turns out that hybrids in most of the US, for example, as you'll see in our paper, fit the bill.
Yeah, that's awesome. Can you talk about the history of the emissions regulations and how they might evolve? Just knowing your background and kind of what are we kind of looking for from where it started to where we're going?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And in researching for the book for Racing Towards Zero, Felix and I really did a deep dive into what are the regulations, historically, what are the regulations? How do they vary around the world? How do we legislate? How do we test to make sure cars actually meet the regulations? And that is maybe not the most interesting chapter in the book. We kind of joke about that in the book, but there's a lot of good information in there. And the emission standards, you probably guessed it, but they really started back in California in the 1960s. That's kind of where the LA smog events and things like that really kind of pushed us towards emissions regulations, and then it sort of evolved from there. We started regulating CO2 as well as criteria pollutants. The Clean Air Act was revised in 1970. The EPA was created, and sort of the rest is history. But one thing about the regulations that always made sense when pretty much all of the cars on the road were internal combustion engine vehicles is that we regulated at the tailpipe, right? And so that makes sense because that is where the bulk of the emissions are created, is at the tailpipe of the vehicle. Now that we've introduced in a much bigger way other technologies, electric vehicles
Hmm.
mainly, they don't have a tailpipe, right? And so they get tagged as zero emissions. And if you know me and if you've read the book, you know that I'm very adamant about saying we should not be using the term zero emission vehicles anymore. That's sort of an outdated term because we know that with electric vehicles, there are a whole lot of emissions that get created elsewhere, right? Not from the tailpipe because the car doesn't have a tailpipe, but how do you produce the battery? How do you create the electricity that is charging the car? And so the regulations, while they made sense, back in the 60s, 70s, and even 20 years ago, they're starting to not make as much sense now because of these other technologies that don't have tailpipes. So what I advocate for is doing something called life cycle analysis, which allows you to look at sort of the emissions created over the entire lifetime of the vehicle. And that's a much more fair way to compare these different technology types. And again, electric vehicles will still come out ahead in a lot of places and for a lot of applications, but in other places and applications they won't. And so the LCA really allows us to reduce GHGs as fast as possible, and those are not part of the regulations now. I and others speak a lot about how they should be. Of course, it's a very complicated topic. There are a lot of assumptions that go into it. Again, if you read the paper in the Journal of Electrified Vehicles that we wrote, it outlines some of those assumptions. But I think it's the best tool we have today to compare and to regulate. So hopefully we evolve into going away from just the tailpipe and doing life cycle analysis on the vehicles.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. I think you have to look at the bigger picture in that kind of context when you're talking about greenhouse gas emissions and where we're kind of going with these regulations. Kind of leads me into my next question here. Now, I know you had did a special blueprint with the SAE Update magazine. Kind of talks about the U.S. transportation decarbonization. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a good question and a timely one. I wrote an article or a commentary article in this month's SAE update. So in the March issue, you can check that out. It's called An Alternative Blueprint for Light Duty Transportation Decarbonization. And what really inspired this article is not too long ago, maybe a couple of months ago, you probably saw that the US came out with the US National Blueprint for Transportation Decarbonization, which is bringing together the DOE, the DOT, the EPA, and also HUD. These four US agencies came together and said, okay, let's write a report that kind of says, kind of focuses on how are we going to decarbonize transportation, not just cars, but across the board. Um, it's a great report in a lot of ways, and it really kind of outlines some of the problems for decarbonization. But what I didn't like about the report, or what I disagree with, is it appeared to, for light duty transportation, so for passenger vehicles, um, it appeared to kind of write off anything but electrification, full electrification. Um, and so again, based on what I talked about earlier and the book and the paper, I think I think we're pushing in that direction maybe too quickly. I think we're missing out significant opportunities to reduce greenhouse gases. And if you look at my alternative blueprint, what I sort of said is, let's look at this on a state by state basis, right? Because where I am in Wisconsin, for example, our electricity grid is very different from, say, Washington State in the Pacific Northwest. And how we create our electricity is very different. And so we're a big country. It would be nice to do everything at a federal level that makes things easier for a lot of people. But really, it's a state by state issue, I believe, because if you look and if you read that article, there's a map of the US in that article, and it kind of shows state by state, are EVs the cleanest today from a greenhouse gas perspective? Are hybrids? Or in a lot of states, it's like a toss up, right? There
Mhm.
really isn't a significant difference. And so I think we should be looking at this on a state by state level. incentivizing state by state. This will also allow us to ramp up the charging infrastructure in the states where it makes the most sense now. And let's learn from, let's learn from that. And then in other states, as the grid becomes cleaner, which hopefully it will, then we can take what we learned in, say, Washington State, Oregon, California, and then apply that to the other states. And so I think, that's really where I differ. Some people look at hybrids and say, well, they've kind of had their day. I don't know if you remember, but at one point, when the Toyota Prius first came out, all the Hollywood stars were driving their Prius, and they were super green and stuff like that. Now Toyota has sort of the hybrid has sort of become an afterthought for a lot of people, and I think it's a huge missed opportunity. I think let's put more full hybrid vehicles into the market as well as plug-in hybrids. And I think we would go a long way to reducing greenhouse gases faster. And the other thing about hybrids, which is so great, is each car uses a lot less battery materials than, say, a Tesla, for example, right? So you can take a 100 kilowatt hour battery that you might use in a vehicle and make, say, don't quote me on this, but 40 or 50, say, batteries for full hybrid vehicles, right? And you're going to reduce CO2 a lot quicker, and so that's kind of where I differentiate, and I think you should revisit this periodically, right? Because the grids are hopefully getting cleaner. I don't necessarily believe that they're going to get clean as fast as some people say. I think there are a lot of challenges there. I mean, I hope they do, but I'm trying to be realistic about it. But let's review this periodically and say, okay, now maybe Wisconsin, maybe our grid is really green now, and we should be incentivizing EVs. And so, yeah, I see in the chat, the grid is definitely getting cleaner. It's not a debate. And so I just want to comment on that. Yes, that is true. But what is interesting, and if you read the paper, we talk about this in great detail, is it's not just about the average grid getting cleaner. So if you ramp up solar, for example, that's awesome. But what is taking the load of the new demand you add to the grid? Oftentimes it's not solar, it's the fossil fuel or maybe hydro. And that's what's so great about the Pacific Northwest is they have a lot of hydropower, which can take some of this increased demand. And so the grid is definitely getting cleaner. It's not a debate. I agree with that. However, it's a lot more complicated than that, is what I'll say. Okay, all right. Hopefully that was a long-winded answer to that question, but I invite everybody to go check out SAE Update and check out my commentary in this month, and also check out the paper.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad you saw the comment, because I was going to say Jason gave you a little shout out and said finally a voice of reason on the topic.
Oh, thank you, Jason.
and
Brian, thank you, Brian. I don't know what Brian was saying yes about, but hopefully it was something that I said that he liked.
Yeah, I saw a few questions. I just want to let the audience know I will be asking them at the end, once we get through the set questions that we had. Kind of moving on to the next question is, where do you think that alternative fuels play a role in the EV and hybrid market today?
Yeah, that's a very timely question, because if you follow what's going on in Europe, right? So thanks, Mark, for the yeah. And by the way, I'm not giving up all the information today, because I want everybody to come see my keynote next month if you want to learn more. But yeah, it's a very timely question, because the EU in the last several months, they've come together and said, okay, we are going to ban internal combustion engines for new passenger cars starting in 2035, I believe. Okay, and that seemed to be kind of the final thing already, but really they needed to stamp that. The final stamp of approval was going to be on March 7th. Okay, but just before, Germany and Italy, to a certain extent as well, said, hey, wait a second, what about e-fuels? Now, if you don't know what an e-fuel is, think about it as a way to replicate a fossil fuel, right? We don't want to burn fossil fuels as much. If we can reduce the amount of fossil fuels we're burning, that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. That's what we're trying to do with the grid. That's what we're trying to do in our vehicles. Okay, so an e-fuel is a way to replicate a hydrocarbon fossil fuel but it's created using renewable energy. Okay, so it's a renewable fuel. So again, if you go back to this tailpipe issue that I talked about earlier, if you just regulate at the tailpipe, you're still going to have CO2 coming out of a car that's running on e-fuels, but it's renewable. And so on it from a net basis, it's zero CO2 or close to zero CO2. Okay, so Germany came out and said, hey, what about e-fuels? We should be allowed to use e-fuels because at the end of the day, they're having the same impact on the environment as, say, an electric vehicle running on a clean grid. And so they did not put that final stamp on the ban. I don't know where it is today, but I'm actually very happy that that happened because that opens the door for alternative fuels. That opens the door maybe for hybrid vehicles to be on the roads longer if they need to be. I'm not saying they should be, but if they need to be. And so that's kind of a very interesting turn of events there. There are other alternative fuels such as biofuels, right? We already know that when you fill up at the gas station, usually some portion of what you're fueling up with is ethanol, right? So biofuels are also renewable fuels, but there the energy comes from the sun essentially instead of from, say, wind or any other sort of renewable electricity. There's also hydrogen. You've probably heard a lot about hydrogen, right? That's a really popular topic. And I'm old enough to remember the other couple times in my lifetime when hydrogen was going to be the next best big thing. It's always the next big thing.
Yeah.
This time feels a bit different. It's gone further along than I think it has in the past. There's a lot more excitement about it, a lot more research going into it. Hydrogen is also tricky from an LCA standpoint because depending on how you make the hydrogen, it can be just as dirty as just burning a fossil fuel directly. But if you're able to create what's called green hydrogen using electrolysis from renewable energy, and it's tricky and it's not the most efficient process and it's expensive again, but we're working on it and hopefully it gets cheaper and more efficient. Then hydrogen starts to look interesting. Now, I don't necessarily think that hydrogen is going to be used in passenger cars to a big extent because I can't imagine putting in a whole nother infrastructure around hydrogen for passenger cars after we've
Mhm.
done it now for electric vehicles. But I think for long haul, where you're fueling up in certain locations, specific locations, I think it could make sense. And not just for internal combustion engines, but also for fuel cell vehicles. So those are, e-fuels, biofuels. We touched on hydrogen. The other one that's kind of interesting is ammonia. Um, that seems to be a popular alternative, or at least there's a lot of research going into it in the marine industry, because electrifying, these big ships, I think, is even more difficult. And so there are a lot of different alternative fuels. And I think, again, when you put bans on technology, you kind of shut down the idea of coming up with new approaches to things like alternative fuels, like renewable fuels. And so that's why I'm very against these bans, just because, you want to let the engineers figure out the best way to get there, right? Not the
Right.
politicians.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. um, yeah, that's great. Thank you for the answer. Now you kind of moving forward. I know as part of WCX, you're also releasing a technical paper that's going to be published next month, correct?
Yes.
Um, just for some of the audience who might not know, what are the kind of steps, or how did you get to this point where you were able to publish technical papers, or if you could give the audience a little bit of background, what kind of goes into publishing a technical paper with SAE?
Yeah, so I've been working on technical papers with SAE, and I won't say how many years because then I'll age myself. But the first time I gave a public presentation in graduate school was at an SAE conference in San Antonio, Texas. It was back when it was the Fall Fuels and Lubes Conference. I was scared to death and I was terrible at it. But it turned out okay, and I think I've improved. I mean, hopefully,
Yeah,
I've been asked to give a keynote this year, so hopefully things have improved. Um, but I guess there's the process. There's submitting the paper and revisions and all of that. That's in some sense that's just kind of turning the crank, and that's pretty similar to a lot of different conferences and journals to publish in. I guess I want to take that question in a different direction,
Mhm.
if you don't mind.
Yeah.
And that comes back to, for example, this Journal of Electrified Vehicle paper that we published, and a lot of things that I published or co-authored kind of in my career. It can be scary to publish something controversial for fear that the rest of the community is going to you know laugh at it, not laugh at it, but like turn their nose up at it or whatever, however you
Mhm.
want to say it.
Yeah.
um, and when I talk to students and I talk to people who's starting to publish, typically if you're doing something that's very meaningful, oftentimes it is controversial to begin with, because you're probably going against the status quo. You're coming up with a new way to do something, right? And if the whole field has been doing it one way for many years and you're saying, no, I think it should be this way, right? And you really believe in it, you're going to have to get over some hurdles, right? And this paper that we did in the Journal of Electrified Vehicles, where we were saying, hey, wait a second, you can't use the average US electricity mix to determine whether an EV or a hybrid or any sort of vehicle is cleaner. You have to do it using the local grid, and you have to do it using what's reacting to the added demand that you're putting on the grid by plugging in an electric vehicle and things like that. There, I can tell you, one of the reviewers especially didn't want to hear it at all, right? And so there was a lot of back and forth. We call him reviewer number 5. Reviewer number 5 didn't want to hear that, and there was a lot of back and forth with reviewer number 5. Other reviewers weren't necessary. A couple of the reviewers were like, right on, that's the way to do it. I'm glad someone's finally doing it that way. A couple of other reviewers were sort of on the fence, and with some back and forth, they were like, okay, this makes sense, let's publish it. That one reviewer, though, it took a long time to get past reviewer number 5. And so what I would say in situations like that is stick with it. If you actually believe what you're doing is right, it'd be easy to just say, okay, like I don't want to, be too controversial in the community or whatever. I'll just put that away and do something else. I would say don't do that. Keep pushing, and eventually it worked out. We got the paper published, and it's already being cited by a lot of folks and read by a lot of folks, and so yeah, it's pretty amazing. So that's the advice I would give. Of course, there are lots of things I could say about submitting the papers, but
Right.
I think what I just said is maybe more valuable.
Yeah. I agree. You answered it great. I think sometimes change is looked at too often as a bad thing when sometimes you just need someone to advocate for it. Kind of going on along with that, you had mentioned, um, you said this is your first keynote speaker position at WCX, correct?
At WCX, yes, I've
Yeah,
done a lot of. Sorry,
gotcha.
I've done a lot. I
Yeah,
don't want to freak Mark out. I've done a lot of keynote talks in my day, but yes,
yeah,
it's the first. It's the first at WCX, which honestly, from an SAE standpoint, I'm very honored to be doing this. I think this is the SAE conference that everybody looks at as sort of the event of the year. Of course, there are a lot of
Mhm.
other great SAE events as well, but this is maybe the biggest one in our field, at least. And people travel from all over the world to attend it. So I'm extremely honored to have been asked to do this, and I'm excited. And I can tell you, not everybody's going to like what I have to say, but I think it's important to keep this dialogue going for
Yeah,
all of the reasons I described already. And I think if we can keep the dialogue going in a way, that isn't personal but is technical, and let's use facts and data, I think at some point we'll all get on the same page with this. And so I'm very excited about it. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
yeah, that's great. I'm excited to hear about it too. And then I did share the link out. If you aren't registered yet, you can go ahead and check out the registration page to come here, Dr. Kelly Senecal, discuss this further. Now, if you have a couple minutes, we have a couple questions from the um, audience here. Obviously,
Sure.
don't give away too much if you're going to be speaking on it next month. But first question we got here is currently the EU is still arguing that the zero emissions policy since Germany tries to bring e-fuels for zero emissions. How do you think the EU ICE ban regulation will impact the US policy if they modify?
That's an interesting question, and yeah, and so I think if the EU modifies it, I think that will be kind of a wake up call for the rest of the world. And that will maybe make people step back and say, wait a second, there are multiple ways to get there, right? And that's what's really important about my message is in a lot of things we need diversity, right? Diversity is a good thing. It brings in different perspectives. In the transportation landscape, we also need diversity. We need diversity in solutions because what's good for me in Wisconsin may not be good for someone in Norway, right? Norway is a great place to drive an electric vehicle, for example. And so we need to really look at what's the local situation and what technology makes the most sense. And so I'm hoping that what this will do is kind of, again, back to the regulations. Well, maybe we shouldn't just be focusing on the tailpipe, because if we focus on the tailpipe, e-fuels look just as bad as fossil fuels. Okay, but we know that's not true from the cycle standpoint. And so I'm hoping that this really helps kind of change the way we think about emissions regulations. That'd be my main point.
Great, great. And I think we got two more. So we got, do you include emissions from oil extraction and life cycle analysis? Also, EVs means different wear and tear on the roads and even the tires. Are those secondary effects included?
Okay, good questions. Yes, we do include, we call them the upstream emissions from internal combustion engines, which would also apply to hybrids. And so we add something like 30% to the emissions that we calculate from what's coming out of the tailpipe. We had another 30% from the upstream emissions, which accounts for what was just described there and other things as well. Because it isn't, even for internal combustion engines, it's not just about what's coming out of the tailpipe. But when all the cars on the road are the same, again, comparing them on that, it's like a level playing field, right? And so, but again, now what we're doing LCA and we want to compare them to electric vehicles, we do need to account for the upstream emissions from engines as well, and their fuels. So that's a really good point. On the electric vehicle wear and tear stuff, so from a greenhouse gas perspective, we don't go so deep as to say if we drive a lot of electric vehicles, we have to redo our roads faster. That's going to also release a lot of carbon into so we don't include that kind of detail into our LCA. Our LCA is just about, from cradle to grave of driving the vehicle. But what I will say about that comment that's a very good point is there's something called non-exhaust emissions that come from tire wear, brake wear, and road wear. Okay. The brake wear part isn't bad for electric vehicles because of the regenerative braking, but the tire wear and the road wear, because electric vehicles are typically heavier, it can be higher than a conventional vehicle. And what you get is particulate emissions that can be higher from what's coming out of the exhaust pipe. And part of that's because we've done such a good job cleaning up what's coming out of the exhaust pipe, right? With after treatment and with cleaning up what, in cylinder processes and things like that. Part of it is because vehicles keep getting heavier. And when you have an electric vehicle, it tends to be even heavier still. And yes, in the upcoming European legislation, the tire emissions are starting to become part of the regulations, which I think is awesome. Something I've been advocating for a while, and we talk about in our book quite extensively. So it's good to see that the regulators are starting to take notice of that.
Awesome. I think we got time for one more here from Michael. Can you give an example of a comparison in a car running on an unleaded fuel, hybrid, and full electric for the same class of car, and what your results were, assuming power plant of the electric company uses natural gas to produce electricity on the grid?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so if the grid is purely natural gas, then the electric vehicle will probably come out ahead of both the hybrid and certainly the conventional vehicle. What really hurts the electric vehicle, I would say, is coal, right? And so there are a lot of states in the U.S. that say, well, we don't produce any coal, right? California, we don't produce any coal, but they import it from other states, right? So if you really start to analyze the grid, it's a lot more. The U.S. grid is crazy. and it's a lot more complicated than some people realize. And so if you look at all of these different aspects, imports, exports, what's being produced locally, you find out that there's a lot more coal going on in the US than you might have otherwise believed, unfortunately. Um, and so even a little bit of coal can hurt you because, again, it depends on what shows up in the grid when you're charging, right? So if you're charging at night, you can't make use of the solar power. In the future, that might change because we'll be storing it and things like that. But currently you're not making as much use of the solar power. You're making use of the coal and the natural gas, for example, from the grid. And so it's real. That's a very, very complicated question. But I will say, and again, I'm shooting from the hip here a little bit, because I don't have the calculation in front of me if the grid was just natural gas. But my suspicion is if you are purely natural gas, I don't know. I have to do that calculation. But I will say natural gas is a lot better than coal, right? Natural gas is a
Mhm.
lot better than coal. Coal is is the really bad one that we need to hopefully get off of ASAP.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Did you have any final thoughts or anything you want to share with the audience before I let you go?
I think I've said enough. Really
Hey,
appreciate you having me on. This is the second time I've done this. The first time was with Felix. We talked about our book. I'm thrilled that I could be here on the 3-year anniversary, I think you said,
yep,
of
yep,
this
3 year
series.
anniversary.
I think that's awesome. I'm glad I got to celebrate that with you all. And I guess I'm excited to see what happens at WCX. I hope all of you can join us for that talk. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and I hope to get some conversation started.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
thank you very
Yeah, we're
much.
looking forward to it as well. Thank you again for volunteering your time. If anyone wants to see the replay or wants to share it, this replay will be up on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days coming here once we get a chance to edit. But if you have any questions, just put them in the comment. Otherwise, Kelly, thank you. Appreciate your time today. I look forward to seeing you next month.
Yeah, me as well. All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.